But the first thing I wanted to ask you about, we've seen a lot of interest in governance reform, and you at World Athletics did a huge governance reform in, I guess it was 2016, when you were flying around the world with Maria Clark and Hugh Roberts and others, I think for months on end. I just wondered if you could give us, the headlines in terms from your perspective as the new president, then at least came in 2015. What were the key learnings for you from that review that you did and the reforms that you made afterwards?
Well, thank you. The first learning really was a recognition that our governances at World Athletics were not strong enough. And it was an instinct that I had come to over my time as a member of the council. Not because there was anything that was sort of lividly obvious, although decisions at best were slightly Byzantine and seemed to sort of come through no hopper that I'd ever recognized in an organization. But, when you're not really there in charge or in a position of particular influence, those are the sorts of things that, you can feel but probably not do a great deal about. Of course, when I became president, within a few weeks, those instincts were brought, front and center in a much more livid way, and that was the very high-profile accusations that have largely been substantiated of late in a French court. And so I had already embarked upon a process of change. I knew that the organization needed to be modernized. I knew that within the structure of that modernization, we had to have systems that were clear and transparent and, and delivered to the end user, which were the member federations. So the first question I really asked myself in that journey that led to the reforms in 2016 there were three questions I asked. The first is, how do you make decisions that are clear and transparent? How do you clear the sight lines between your grassroots chair of a local athletics club and somebody sitting, at the level of world presidency? Then a tougher one, who do you actually want in your sport? And that had clearly gone slightly awry in the previous years. And only when you've answered those two questions can you fundamentally answer the final and probably the most important question: how on earth do you grow the sport in a way that it remains salient and exciting and interesting for young people? So that was the starting point. The key learning was that you don't do that by sort of unilateral diktat. You don't sit in the center and say, I'm changing the constitution, or I'm changing the governance structure, or I'm going to recraft roles and responsibilities. You have to take people with you. So the first learning was, don't expect to sit there at the center and just because you wish it that way, that everybody else is going to, come trotting to your headquarters and understand it, and then vote on little or no information at a Congress. So really, John, for about the space of 6 to 9 months, I did nothing but be on the road with the chair of my legal commission, Maria Clark, and the reform group made up of, some really, some people that are best in class at that. And we took it out to the 6 continental areas, and we teased out the issues. Some of the conversations were pretty feisty. Yes, we trimmed on occasions, but we got it across the line. But we got it across the line in a pragmatic way and a culturally savvy way, because if you're trying to make massive changes in a sport that covers 200 and something countries, then, for instance, one of the pillars was about gender equality, about driving gender equality within the sport. Well, there are going to be, for cultural reasons and for good historic cultural reasons, some of those challenges are going to be greater in some countries and territories than in others. So I think we were pragmatic, but above all, we communicated what it was that we were wanting to achieve, why we were doing it, because we were in a very sorry state as a sport, given what we'd had to deal with, both across corruption and doping. And then once people felt that they'd had some skin in the game, that they'd been able to shape and craft what we were doing, and it wasn't just cosmetic, it wasn't us just turning up and saying, look, there's a PowerPoint presentation, take it or leave it. It was really going back and understanding what people had said to you on that trip, and and adapting and augmenting what you already had in terms of the work from the governance group. So I think the overall learning was, don't try and make these changes as a lone run for home. You won't do that. You need to take people with you, and that takes time, and you need to get to them. Don't expect them to come to you.
Well, and I can see that, and I've heard Maria say that in various different contexts. But it is a pretty substantial undertaking when you've got such a coverage as you've got in your sport. And it did. I remember you were away for about 6 or so months. But one of the things I wanted to focus on, one outcome, the Athletics Integrity Unit, and the reason is, looking at some other sports, it does seem to me we shamelessly ripped off your ideas for biathlon recently, and they now have a biathlon integrity unit. But actually, it's a similar story where weakness of governance controls led to poor decision making, and it took that crisis for the executive board to even contemplate the idea that they should give up some control. And that's an interesting thing. When I talk to people about the Athletics Integrity Unit, which has been a big success, the instinct is, how can we give up control? We're responsible. We've been put in charge. We need to control these things. We can't give up control to anyone. Have you heard that? And what are your thoughts when people say things like that, given the experience with the Athletics Integrity Unit?
Well, I'm smiling at just one of those concepts about giving up control. I do remember having a sense. Actually, it was a conversation with somebody whose judgment I do actually value, and continue to do. But they did actually look at me at one point when I was explaining how, for instance, we would rebalance the power of the president so that decisions couldn't be made individually. There would be an executive board. There would be tiers of governance structure that would, prevent me from doing something that was egregious or just frankly stupid. And they actually looked at me and said, "Why have you've worked so hard to become president of the sport? Why are you so lightly giving up your power?" And I said, "Look, I'm not giving up power. I'm actually sharing it. I didn't come into the sport to take power. I came into the sport to actually enable others at every level in the sport to feel that they had some sort of collegiate responsibility to the sport." And there was that view that this was just something that didn't make a lot of sense. You worked for so many months and years to do this, and yet here you are handing it, effectively the power of attorney over to other people. So I did have to overcome that, and we did. I guess I have a problem with even the terminology governing body, because it is, of course, what it is, and that is a big chunk of Victoriana. All our federations, I seem to remember around about 1970, the 70s, that every national governing body in the UK was celebrating its centenary. It was athletics, it was the 3As, it was FIFA, or certainly the FA. I don't actually like the use of the word governing body, because I think that sets you off anything other than due north. The days of being able to command and control in any organisation are over. whether it's the International Olympic Committee, whether it's my own sport, whether it's, even within government, there are micro players out there that you have to be cognizant of and you have to work with. So the days of a president sitting there for 20, 30 something years, I have 5 predecessors in world athletics, or what was the IAAF. We were founded in 1912. One of my predecessors did 46 years. Went from something like 1946 to the mid 70s, and one of them only did 7 years. So the average tenure was 31 years. I can confidently tell everybody I will not be doing 31 years. Why? Because actually we now have term limits. So it's the basis of power, even the definition of power, has now so fundamentally altered that I think even the expression governing body is a slightly archaic way of looking at what a sport properly structured should do. So look, re-engineering, you're right. I mean, we did re-engineer. Sadly, all organizations tend to re-engineer only when they have to. As my father, who was an engineer, always used to fondly say to me, look, it's much better to figure this stuff off while the plane is safely on the ground, rather than trying to figure out, how you're going to land it at 36,000 feet when all the engines are clapping out. And the integrity unit, I have to say, is probably, and I will say it, is probably one of my proudest achievements. It was absolutely centre of the reforms. And it was a clear, interestingly, I'd identified the need for an integrity unit in my election manifesto before I was remotely aware of probably the importance and the need to get it up and running quite as quickly as we had to. But, the background to it, John. We'd had a grotesque intrusion into doping violations from Russia, not uniquely Russia, but on this occasion, lividly Russia. My predecessors had also behaved in a way that was entirely inappropriate. And so the integrity unit, I think, is very different from anything else that is currently in the world of sport, because we're not just dealing with anti-doping. I think I recognised early on, as did the reform group, that if you have anti-doping as an issue, you almost certainly have a hinterland of other corrupt practices around it. So we have the integrity unit is a 26, 27 strong organisation, and a good over half of them have international investigative experience. And so we've had to deal with a great deal more than just resolving and bringing to adjudication or sanction doping violations. We have had to deal with some quite high profile issues that go beyond doping. But sadly, my instinct is if you have a sport that has even at its fringes, doping challenges, you find other things that are going on at the same time.
Right, and the integrity code at World Athletics now is another model of its kind, and it covers, your governance issues, your doping, your corruption, safeguarding, the full gamut. And having
election integrity is an important one, and we saw that working extremely well at the last Congress in our World Championships in 2019 in Doha.
And right, we did. And also the thing that I've seen for a long time is when you do a match fixing case or you do a doping case, it's basically the same thing. It's just that in one, sometimes you can catch them by testing their urine in a pot. Really, that's the only difference. But you've touched on a couple of things. Term limits. You've now got eligibility requirements for people who are standing for office. But you also then have this integrity unit. And the key thing is that the decisions, do we investigate someone? Do we charge someone? Including, staff members, officials, members of the board, members of the executive committee. It's not made by you. It's made by the AIU, and that's the one of the revolutionary things. And that's the thing that people balk at when I talk to them about it, and they say either why would I want to give up that control, or isn't that my responsibility to do that job? And that's why I'm interested to ask you, because you were facing that. How does it feel? How did it feel giving up that decision making, and how does it feel now?
Well, I can go one stage further than that, John. And I think the proof of the pudding in the independence of that structure is in two key areas. Firstly, you're right; they will make a judgment, or different groups within that organisation will make judgments about whether something needs further investigation, and if it does, the extent of that investigation, and then ultimately the sanction. And I guess the proof of the pudding in all these organisations is: would you be prepared to look at the very nominally the top person in that organisation, and they were, and they wanted to understand an exchange that took place on the floor of one of the committee rooms in a select committee that I attended, where there was an accusation that I had misled the committee, and that was then put to what was then the ethics board. It was effectively in part driven through the workings of the athletic integrity unit, and they looked at it, and so in exactly the same way, I have always said that the athletics integrity unit, when it comes to anti-doping violations, will be absolutely fearless about reputation. It doesn't really matter what level of the sport you're in. If you fall foul, you will be held to exactly the same accountability as somebody who has maybe a lesser status in the sport. And I think it was a very important message that these structures were prepared to look at the president himself. And actually, that's always a slightly disarming moment, but that's when that organization that you have helped create is actually doing the right job.
But it also means, doesn't it, that you can then say to people, well, you don't have to worry about whether you can be confident in this decision, because it wasn't me. I wasn't involved in judging myself. I wasn't involved in judging other people on the board. It's independent people who are making these decisions. I think that's the thing that people miss out on, because you necessarily, if you take a decision as an executive board, for example, about integrity, let's say you took the best decision in the world that said we shouldn't be charging the Russian president with this offence. Might be the best offence in the world, but people are going to say, well, you're conflicted because Russia's an important country, or they've got stars, and that's the thing that people seem to miss. So and I'm glad you agree on that.
I think it's a really look. Organisations need to be tested. If you say they're independent, how can you demonstrate that? And for me, that's a very clear judgment. I think, interestingly, I still get occasionally questions from the media when I'm doing my media sessions, and they would say, well, yeah, but talk to me about so and so, and I said, well, I can't. And they said, oh yeah, well, I understand you can't, but off the record. I said, no, there is no off the record here. I can't. It's not because I won't. I can't because I don't know, and nor should I be. You would be. My answer to some. Sometimes I get questions in the media and on others in the sport. I say, you should be worried if I'm able to answer this question, because I cannot tell you the process that this is now going through. All I can tell you is it will be safe and secure, and I will probably have, or my communications team may have, an hour's notice before it becomes public, but that will be the extent of it. And I think that there is still, look, these things always take time to culturally embed. I think now people are beginning to recognize that, for instance, around anti-doping, these are tough judgments that are made, but nobody is, is sitting there, nor should they be sitting there remotely thinking, well, I'm an Olympic champion or a triple world record holder, and therefore, this organisation will think I'm far too big to be disposable in the sport. Those days have gone.
Can I turn to one other subject?
Yeah, of course, please. Yeah.
You said one thing that I've spent some time with you on is an area where we dealt with eligibility rules for competition in the female category, the Semenya case.
Yeah.
And then more recently, eligibility for those using blades, prosthetic blades, the Leeper case, to compete. And in both cases, it has ended up that person, Semenya in one case, Leeper in another, has been told that they can't compete in the way and under the conditions that they want to. And so people say, well, World Athletics, you're excluding people from the sport. You're supposed to be including people. You're not supposed to be discriminating. You're excluding people. And I'd love to hear you on that, because to me, it's a very good example of a place where a governing body, understanding you saying it's a bit Victorian, that term, but someone does have to stand up and take a stand about what they think is important for the sport, even if it takes them into controversy. And I do think, if I may say, that's what World Athletics has done. It stood up for what it thinks is right. But I know you know about this because I know you spent a very enjoyable day at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. I know you enjoyed that.
I've had a few of those days, John.
Yes.
Normally with you.
Yes. But anyway, tell me, if you could, just what does World Athletics say? Is it being exclusionary? Is it being inclusionary? Where do you stand on this?
Look, I think my fallback position on this is a very simple one, and that was really not my words, but the words of the Court of Arbitration and subsequently the Swiss Federal Tribunal that upheld the decision that the Court of Arbitration made. That the proposals, the regulations that we tabled that caused the appeal were proportionate and necessary. And look, I was elected to, where possible, maintain the levelest of playing fields in a whole series of areas. We have two classifications in sport. There's gender and there's age. Gender, because if you didn't have that separation, no woman would ever win another sporting event, and that's reality. And age, because it was, it's considered better not to have Olympic champions running against 15-year-old kids in county championships. So these are two really important categories. When it comes to the challenges we confronted with DSD, and John, again, I guess this was, one of those things that ended up in my burning in tray, along with transfer of allegiance and, Russia and governance reform. It was very clear to me that I needed to find an approach here that was absolutely the antithesis of what many have concluded that I've done, which is sort of stigmatized and separated and caused, a group of athletes the inability to compete. I think I've done absolutely alternate. I think I've done quite the opposite. I found a navigable route through, and I've always tended to do that in sport if I possibly can. I didn't, for all sorts of reasons, want to visit the sins of the parents upon the children in our Russia challenge. What, in simple terms, does that mean? If I could identify clean athletes that were untainted but in a tainted system, then my responsibility was to try and find a construct that would allow them to compete. And that's where we got our authorized neutral athletes from. And many of them have maintained international competition in the last few years. They don't have the panoply of uniforms and national anthems, but actually most of them are just relieved to be competing. And when it came to DSD, look, if I'm being hard-nosed about it, if I'd stuck simply to the definitions around biology, then it probably I would have got support for preventing those athletes from competing at all in a female category. I didn't want to do that. So finding the right level of controllable testosterone over a period that allowed them to compete at those distances was, for me, absolutely in alignment with every philosophy, every principle that I went into the sport for. But, then you get the next challenge, well, about human rights, and I'm very acutely conscious of human rights. But the question I then ask is, but, whose human rights are we talking about here? Are we talking about the millions of girls that enter athletics and want to feel that they are competing at least on a level footing? Do I have a concern about them? Yes, I do. But I also wanted to do that and preserve that in a way that didn't stigmatize and cause hurt and challenge to other athletes. Look, it was a difficult decision to make. The easier decision would have frankly been there and sat there and done absolutely nothing at all, which is, if I'm being honest, where pretty much the most of sport has gone now. Right. It's a template that they're all beginning to adopt. And we also have a similar challenge around transgender, and our policy there was in large part driven and in alignment with what we've done around DSD. So, look, you don't come into any sport at the level that I chose to get elected at and think you're going to make a lot of friends. You do have to do what you think is in the best interests of the sport, and possibly that judgment is made way beyond the term that you are serving. That's the reality of life.
Well, obviously, I agree with you. What I find, and when I talk to other sports federations, and we tell them, look, the test for whether or not what you're doing is defendable is it necessary to achieve your vital sporting objectives, and is it proportionate to do so? But I say to them, look, if it is necessary, then it's necessary to go as far as you need to go to achieve them. And if that means standing above the parapet and taking some blows, then that's your job as a governing body. And it's surprising that there are some great people who do a lot of good things, but there are some, and you can understand why. It's expensive, the legal costs, the abuse you get on social media. But to me, if you've decided it's necessary to do it to save something fundamental about your sport, here, as you've said, fair competition in the female category, then you don't really have a choice, seems to me.
I think that's true, and I think that probably, in a more articulate way than I've managed to sum it up, probably in a way also sums up what leadership is about. It can be Arctic lonely out there. I know that the approach we took to Russia, talk about Russia, didn't leave us, in a position of unalloyed joy with other sporting organizations out there. In fact, when we all went to the Rio Games, you could feel the icy blast about what we'd done. And the same for many of the other challenges. Transfer of allegiance was a really good example. When I looked at this in the cold light of day, I found it difficult to actually divorce what I was witnessing in sport from sort of a cruder form of human trafficking. And so, look, you do make those decisions. It doesn't always, it doesn't win you immediate plaudits, but I don't want athletics to ever be on the wrong side of history here. And I think I'd rather take the brickbats, on a temporary basis than lose our way in what is a complicated world. And while I'm president of the sport, I will go on making decisions with my colleagues that I think are the right decisions. And ultimately, this is the democratic nature of sport as well, because we are a federation of 214 countries. We have one member, one vote. If they don't like the approach I'm taking, then they have effectively a ballot box every 4 years to express that displeasure.
You do. And look, briefly on Leeper. So Leeper's the double amputee.
Yes.
What struck me about that, and actually the CAS agreed again, was actually it was the same thing. It fundamentally as the Semenya case. It's about saying we want the competition that we're watching to be on a level playing field and determined by the things that we want to value, by your natural skills and abilities, and not by some external factor that other people don't have, and it is therefore unfair. Not in a cheating way, just in a straightforward, very pure sports way. So just as a woman competing would want to say, I don't want to have someone with these male levels of testosterone. So someone, and Ed Moses was very good in that case. He spoke compellingly. And he said, look, the sacrifices we make, I want to know that if I give my all and everyone gives their all, the best person wins. And it's based on sheer talent, sheer determination, and nothing else. And in the end, seems to me that's the essence of sport, certainly the essence of sports law.
John, look, sport would not have survived 3 weeks, let alone 33 centuries, if it had been based on anything other than free, fair, open competition, where, there is a modicum of understanding that, you have rules and regulations, and that those rules and regulations are to protect those, those sacred pillars. And look, whenever, it's always a sense of, look, anything that relates to issues around disability are inevitably going to be sensitive. And I really won't bow to anybody in my belief and passion about Paralympic sport, or sport for, that is enjoyed by people with disability and impairment. I spent 7 years, I hope, I like to feel, delivering probably the strongest and the most exciting Paralympic Games we've ever had. But there does have to be an understanding within those frameworks, on exactly the same basis that you and I and other colleagues of mine looked at transfers of allegiance and DSD and some of the transgender issues. We do have a responsibility to try and do what we think is right at the time and for the majority of people in the sport. So look, this is these are always contested arguments, but we, I think, have always come through because we've always rallied good intellectual rigor and common sense, and we haven't run for the hills as soon as the first shot has been fired. And that's important, because leadership is actually not just about it's not just about taking people to the top of the mountain. It's making sure that when you start getting into heavy going halfway up, your first instinct isn't just to head back to base camp, but inspire people to keep going. So look, I think we have made the right decision, and we will defend that decision, and it's based on nothing other than than science and our own, what I think are good instincts.
Seb, that's fantastic. I've taken up a lot of time. I want to wrap up there because I know you're a busy man.